This is lesson 212. Civilization begins in Mesopotamia. We're going to learn a lot about Mesopotamia. Here is our objective. Twofold, actually. Explain why the first civilizations began and also describe Mesopotamia and its contributions to us, mankind. And we've got some important words that you're going to want to be familiar with for test purposes. And I'll just go through them real quick. A river valley civilization. What is that? BCE and BC. Now, these are two ways to denote time when you're talking about history. And we're going to go into that more when we have a timeline to show you. But suffice it to say that BCE stands for before Common Era, and BC stands for before Christ. They both mean the exact same thing. It's just that BCE was invented because not everyone was comfortable with saying BC. Mesopotamia, what is that? What is Babylon? What is Sumer? These are places and civilizations all within Mesopotamia. The Fertile Crescent, what is that? The Code of Hammurabi, or you can also call it Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi was a person, by the way. Deity, the word deity, what does that mean? We've got two rivers, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. It's not the Euphrates, it's the Euphrates. Polytheism, that's a type of religion. Very important. City-state. Students have a lot of trouble with this concept of a city-state. Cuneiform, what is that? A ziggurat. Irrigation. An empire. A type of government called a monarchy. And Akkad. The first four civilizations. There were four very early civilizations that emerged between 3500 BCE and 2000 BCE. And like I said, if you don't know what BCE means, it's the very same thing as BC, and we'll explain these later. These first four civilizations developed in four different river valleys in the Earth's eastern hemisphere. And these four civilizations laid the foundations for later civilizations, including ours right here in America in the 21st century. We often call these first four civilizations the river valley civilizations. And that's because they were all located in river valleys, because rivers provide water for irrigation and for transportation. So Mesopotamia had the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Egypt had the Nile River. The Harappan civilization in India, actually Pakistan now, had the Indus River, and the Shang dynasty in China had the Huanghe River or the Yellow River. Here's a somewhat better map. You know, this map right here has the red arrows that point to where on the planet, really, these civilizations were. And this is a little bit better because it shows the civilizations and the territories that they occupied in color. Natural factors supported these river valleys. There were animals already living in these areas like sheep and pigs and goats and cattle and oxen and horses, etc., that you could domesticate. And there were physical barriers that isolated these river valleys from invasions and raids by people from outside. And so the Nile and Mesopotamia had deserts to protect them, and the Indus River Valley and the Yellow River Valley civilizations had mountains, most notably the Himalayas, to protect them. And there were human factors that favored these river valleys. Nomadic hunter-gatherers went to these favorable lands to find more food, but once these people learned how to farm, they created more permanent settlements there. And these permanent settlements eventually led to distinct civilizations that adapted to the local conditions and the environment. And so this settling down into permanent dwelling places changed everything about how we humans, you and me, around the world live. And the first big change that you had was that now you could have a place to store extra food. When you were living on the road, so to speak, when you were nomadic, following a migratory lifestyle, you couldn't carry that much food along with you, and you couldn't preserve meat. And so now that you're in a permanent dwelling place, you can have a food surplus. So extra food is what we call a food surplus. And with that food surplus, you could feed a few people who did something other than just farming. So this ability to have a food surplus led to the development of other kinds of non-farming occupations, like potters and weavers and tanners and blacksmiths and artisans and merchants and priests and soldiers and kings and servants, and the list goes on and on and on. And this diversification of jobs is what we call the division of labor. And that led to massive changes in our experience of life, job specialization, and unequal wealth and status. And that led to the development of social classes, your status in society, who's better than you, who's not as good as you, who's at the top, who's at the bottom, based largely on what your job was. Let me illustrate it this way to show you how easy the connection really is. Because let's face it, look, a farmer, a soldier, a priest, and a king. You take those four guys, you know already they are not going to have the same social status. And so these classes, these various social classes, needed more complex religious and government institutions to maintain this order and stability that existed among these different social classes, because these different social classes could have friction between them, and you need institutions to nullify those kinds of tensions. And so the first empire that we know of was known as Akkad, and it was first ruled by our first recorded emperor named Sargon. And here's a couple of pictures of him right here. This one picture down here makes him look like a cyclops. It's a bad picture. He really had two eyes. That picture just makes it look weird. And you can see the size of his empire, which was actually quite large. Finally, you had these more complex institutions, like these religious and political and economic institutions, developed complex characteristics that we're familiar with, like, for example, a writing system, or organized religion, trade goods, a commercial life, local culture. Mesopotamia began in what we like to call the Fertile Crescent. And there's a map of the Fertile Crescent right here. It's in green, and Mesopotamia is right there in orange. Notice how the Fertile Crescent kind of looks crescent-shaped, and you can see the hook going down along the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea right there. Contributions from Mesopotamia that are still with us to this day. The wheel. If you can make a wheel, you can make a cart for transportation. If you can make a wheel, you can make a chariot for warfare. Wheels are also used, as you know, for pottery. Here's another invention, the sundial, which uses shadows cast in sunlight to tell the time of day. The sail. You can put a sail on a boat and make that boat more powerful and transport more goods and people. Bronze working. Bronze is a very, very important alloy. A writing system that we call cuneiform. The word cuneiform is Greek for wedge-shaped. It's first known writing in the world, and it consisted of pictographs that were scraped into wet clay tablets by some kind of wedge-shaped instrument. And you had your wet clay tablet, and you would write your information down, or you'd scrape your information down with this instrument. And when the clay dried, you had a permanent record. And that's how we know so much about the Mesopotamians, because of these clay tablets that survived. You had fortified city walls to protect that food surplus. Ziggurats, not to be confused with what we will study later, pyramids. These were stepped pyramids. The pyramids that we'll talk about in Egypt, not only did they have a different look, but they also had an entirely different function. The Mesopotamians invented the science of astronomy, and as we know, they invented the potter's wheel. and the first literature. Now that you've got a writing system, now that you've got cuneiform, let's write some cool stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, an epic poem. And thank you, Mesopotamians, the first schools. And you can see a picture right here of a classroom in Mesopotamia and the teacher instructing the students. The ziggurat. Here's a cool picture of a ziggurat. A ziggurat was a step pyramid temple used for worshiping the gods. Got a couple more pictures of some ziggurats. The ziggurat was the center of Mesopotamian life, and it could be seen from miles away. You might be working out in a field 20 miles from town, and you could still look up and see that ziggurat where your gods are being appeased and worshipped. 32 ancient ziggurats have been discovered in the area of Mesopotamia by archaeologists. The importance of geography. Mesopotamia was a harsh, deserty place, desert environment, with two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, whose tributaries crisscrossed each other all the way down through this valley. And there was very little timber, very little stone for construction, but one thing you did have was this: rivers provided plenty of mud, clay, and reeds for making adobe bricks. And when you think about ancient people making adobe bricks right there on the riverside, it sounds pretty savage. But if you look at this picture, it shows that the business of making mud bricks was actually a pretty sophisticated commercial industry, as you can see. The name Mesopotamia is Greek for between the rivers. That's not what the Mesopotamians called it. They didn't speak Greek. We call it that because Mesopotamia was in the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And these rivers still flow today. You could go and visit them if you wanted to. Of course, you don't want to. They're in Iraq. But these rivers flood yearly, and they leave silt in the soil, which makes the soil rich for a thriving agricultural civilization. But just having rivers that flood every year is not enough to sustain an agricultural civilization. In order to have a consistent, reliable agricultural civilization, the peoples, and yes, that is plural, the peoples of Mesopotamia needed to figure out how to control and direct the flooding of these two rivers. And you've got a hint as to how they did it right there, because what you've got is somebody has dug a nice long ditch for that water to flow in, and they're looking over their handiwork, making sure it's working just right, as you can see. And so therefore the peoples of Mesopotamia, and like I said, that's plural, developed vast complex systems of drainage ditches and irrigation works. And you can see it right here. This little village right here is on the shore, not of a sea or an ocean, that's on the shore of one of the rivers, the Tigris or the Euphrates. And you can see an irrigation ditch going off, from the shore of that river into the fields. Mesopotamia was not a unified country. Instead, it was a hodgepodge of many independent city-states. And like I said before, that word city-state gives students a lot of trouble. A city-state is a city that exists as its own independent sovereign country with its own king and everything. The city of Uruk is an example of one Mesopotamian city-state, but there were many. Ancient Mesopotamia covered three general areas: Assyria, Akkad, and Sumer. But many states occupied these areas over a long period of time. So the Mesopotamian civilization involved many peoples. The Sumerians, the people of Sumer, they were very important, and they were just one of these various Mesopotamian civilizations. The importance of religion. The Mesopotamian environment, as we said, was harsh, difficult, and unpredictable. So it was logical for the Mesopotamians to believe that the world was controlled by harsh, destructive supernatural forces and deities. And when I say deities, I mean gods. Mesopotamians were a polytheistic culture, and polytheistic means that in their religion they believed in many gods and goddesses, not just one. And they identified about 3,000 different gods that they believed in. What was the relationship like between the gods and humans? Well, the Mesopotamians believed that human beings were made to serve and obey and suffer the gods and goddesses. The Sumerians believed that human beings were created to do the manual labor that the gods and the goddesses didn't want to do. And so the gods were moody, they had a lot of hang-ups, they were unpredictable, like the environment. And as inferior beings, people could never be sure whether these gods, these deities, might be in the mood to help them or hurt them. So due to these harsh conditions, the Sumerians, for example, invented several tools and devices that made daily life easier and more productive. And we've talked about these, including, for example, the wagon wheel and the potter's wheel and the sundial. Now, let's say that you are a Mesopotamian king. And look how thoughtful this Mesopotamian king looks. And he's asking himself this. He's having this conversation with himself. You need to establish order among the various peoples in your kingdom. And you also need to establish a sense of unity in your kingdom. What's the best way to do that? And the way that we're going to talk about is one that we're going to see over and over again, really throughout our year in world history. How about this one? How about a single set of laws? A set of laws that apply to everyone, sort of. Everybody can read the laws, everybody can understand the laws, and everybody knows what these laws require of them. Hammurabi's Code. Now this code, this law code, was written about 1750 BC, or BCE, and it's the first written law code in history that we know of. At least it's the first one that we have in its complete form. We may have some, specs or some little pieces of previous ones. But it was issued by the Babylonian King Hammurabi, and it was posted on stone pillars all over the place, all over the kingdom, for everybody to read. And Hammurabi wanted to unify his empire with a common law to help him govern Babylon, the Babylonian Empire. And he also wanted to create social order within his empire. The Code of Hammurabi, or Hammurabi's Code, is one of the world's most important early systems of law. And it calls for harsh punishments against criminals and the principle of retaliation, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is fundamental in Hammurabi's Code. However, let me just explain something about this, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, because in our minds, to us, it sounds very vengeful and very harsh. But keep in mind, the prevailing wisdom of this day was, pay your enemy back in spades. Whatever your enemy does to you, no matter what he does to you, if he does something to you, anything that you do to him back is justified. If you take out my eye, I'm going to take off your head. If you take out my tooth, I'm gonna destroy your face. And so the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was Hammurabi's Code's way of saying, hey, back off, relax, don't get carried away, let's keep things even. Punishments in Hammurabi's Code varied according to your social status and your standing before the law. And we talked about what determines social status. A lot of that is determined by what your job is. And so, for example, a crime committed against a nobleman would bring you a much harsher punishment than committing that exact same crime against a peasant or a commoner. Hammurabi's Code published punished public officials who failed in their duties or who were corrupt. It also had what we might call consumer protection. For example, holding builders responsible for the quality of their work. If you made a shoddy building and it collapsed and killed somebody, well then if you're the builder, you were executed. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The largest group of laws in Hammurabi's code covered marriage and family law. And that brings up a very important point about these law codes, because the most important thing about Hammurabi's code isn't so much that it informs us about what their laws were. The most important thing about Hammurabi's code is that it gives us a window into what these people were like, what made them tick, how they viewed the world, what their daily life was like. In Hammurabi's code, parents arranged marriages, and the bride and the groom had to sign a marriage contract to be officially married, just like today. Hammurabi's code also enforced the obedience of children to their parents. Technically, a father could cut off the hand of a son who hit him, for example. And so that is Mesopotamia for now. I hope you found that informative. I hope it helps you pass your quiz or your test. And we'll see you in the next lesson.